Well, hello and welcome everybody to our presentation, Navigating Speech and Swallowing, Living with ALS. I am very excited to introduce our speaker, Jessica Bottone. I've had the honor of working with Jessie in our ALS clinic, and I can tell you she is knowledgeable, kind, and compassionate. Jessie has been a dedicated speech-language pathologist at Columbia University Medical Center for 18 years. She has worked tirelessly with the ALS community for 11 of those years. She recently joined the Hospital for Special Surgery as at the ALS multidisciplinary team. Jessie is passionate about supporting ALS patients and committed to giving the best guidance, care, and support to navigate this complex disease. Before I introduce Jessie to start, if you have any questions, you can enter them into your Whova app or the Q&A box. So with no further ado, I present Jessie.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much, Eileen, for the introduction. I am going to share my screen and get started. Okay. All right, so here we go. So this, just before we start, this is a pretty general presentation. I'm going to try to hit on a little bit of everything. I might spend a little more time focused on certain areas, but please, if you have any questions or want me to go into further detail, just we can go through it at the end. All right, so here we go. All right, so just a quick agenda. I'm going to obviously talk about swallowing. We'll talk about some things to maybe look out for, some compensatory strategies, some maybe preventative measures that we could focus on early on. We'll talk about communication. We'll talk about compensatory strategies, alternative assistive options. We'll talk about voice and message banking. So that's pretty much what this talk will entail. So let's start with swallowing. Dysphagia, which you might come across in a lot of the research or, at your clinic visits or whatnot, is basically the blanket term for trouble swallowing that can include difficulty arising from motor and or sensory deficits in the mouth, the throat, and the esophagus. About 85% of PALS will experience some degree of dysphagia. So this can be an initial symptom. So for example, if you have a bulbar onset ALS, this might be the first symptom that you notice. And I think about like 25 to 33% of all ALS diagnoses start with bulbar onset. So it's not as common. It tends to be more common in women. And we find that it tends to be an onset in the older population as well. So a person who has dysphagia is really at increased risk of having foods and liquids get misdirected into the airway instead of down towards the stomach, which can lead to respiratory illnesses, pneumonia, and some other complications. And we also know dysphagia can result in malnutrition, dehydration, poor appetite, and weight loss. And I think we know from all of our dietitians and our neurologists as well that we don't like to see weight loss in ALS, and we want you to maintain your weight as much as possible to stay strong and as healthy as possible. Some signs of difficulty with swallowing Can be that it's taking longer to chew. The meals might be taking a longer time. You might find that food is getting stuck in your gums, on the roof of your mouth, in your teeth, and this may have never happened before. Sometimes we'll see that food or liquids might spill from the front of the mouth. That usually happens if there's some lip weakness and we can't kind of hold on to everything. We might find some pretty like overt signs, or we might be throat clearing, coughing, choking, have like a wet, gurgly sounding voice, an increase in phlegm or mucus, like during or right after meals. Those could all be pretty, overt signs that we're having some difficulty. In rare cases, we'll see nasal regurgitation where food and liquid is actually exiting through the nose. That's not too common, but it can happen. We'll see weight loss, and sometimes even an increase in saliva as well. So what can we do to kind of help manage this? Number one, I would say slow down. I know it sounds silly. It sounds like a super easy thing to do, but most of us have, our habits. We eat and drink a certain way. We're not often paying attention to it. And literally just slowing down a little bit, taking your time, taking smaller bites, smaller sips can make a huge difference, and just give your body that extra time it needs to get everything down safely. We also want to make sure we're sitting upright, that we're limiting distractions, that we're not talking with food or liquid in your mouth, which always seems to be the challenging one. If we're having any respiratory difficulties, it's harder to breathe, the act of chewing and swallowing is actually taxing that system even more, right? So what happens, when you swallow, you have this kind of like coordination that happens between your breathing muscles and your swallowing muscles, in order to ensure that everything gets down safely. So if we're having increased work of breathing, we're short of breath when we're eating, we're kind of gasping for air, that kind of increases the risk that we're going to aspirate or inhale some foods or liquids down the wrong way. Sometimes what else we can do, we can modify consistencies. So maybe choosing softer foods, cooking things a little longer, sometimes chopping things up, adding sauce, potentially like chopping up in a food processor or blending foods in a blender. All of those things can help modify the consistency. We can thicken our liquids. We'll talk about that a little more in the next slide. We can also use some adaptive utensils or compensatory strategies. So, adaptive utensils could be something like a nosy cup that's kind of cut out on one side, that allows you to kind of keep your head neutral as you're, taking a sip of liquid. It could be something like a measured, like a regulated drinking cup that actually measures the amount of liquid that's coming out at once to kind of ensure that you're getting a small kind of bolus size instead of a huge sip. You can use smaller spoons and forks, or, maybe the OT might recommend some more adaptive utensils as well that are a little easier for you to grip and control. And then as far as compensatory strategies, we could use something maybe like a chin tuck where you kind of posture your head downwards, which gives our body a little extra time and kind of closes off some of that empty space in the back of the throat, which makes our muscles be able to push things down a little easier. So again, these are just some examples of what you could do. General I just put a few images of the thickeners up here. And again, the thickeners are used to kind of slow down the liquids and give our body some extra time to be able to kind of catch and control the liquid. A lot of times when we have weakness in our tongue muscles, especially, becomes really challenging to kind of cup and control the food or liquid that's in our mouth, right? So something like a thin liquid is going to travel very fast. It's going to be very difficult to kind of catch and to hold. So the thickeners kind of give it a little extra weight and kind of help kind of slow it down. And give your body a little extra time. Kind of just holds it together, right? So the first image you see here is the gel thickener. I would say that's the most common one. That's the one that most of the healthcare facilities will use and stock. It is the more expensive option, but it does mix better. Most patients prefer the taste of, or even though it's supposed to be tasteless, they prefer, the taste of the gel thickener versus the powders. The other two on there are kind of classic powder thickener examples that have been on the market for a long time. Again, they're easy to find. They're in most of your local like drugstores or like a Walmart. Sometimes the supermarket might even have it. And they're cheaper than the gel thickeners, and easy to use. I would say the downside with those, you kind of have to mix the drink right when you're about to drink it and consume it within like 15 to 20 minutes. If not, they tend to kind of congeal, and it is not something that that you would like to drink at that point. So again, just a couple of examples of things you can do there. To kind of move on a little bit, and talk about some kind of prophylactic or preventative measures, I wanted to kind of focus part of this presentation on RMST, which is respiratory muscle strength training. Okay. So there's two different types. There's expiratory muscle strength training and inspiratory muscle strength training. We'll break them both down, talk about each of them. But if you are early stage in the disease process, this is something I would definitely recommend talking to your doctors and your speech therapist about, maybe the respiratory therapist as well. But this is something that can be helpful. So the image here that we have on the right, this is the EMST 150. It's one of the probably most popular expiratory muscle training devices on the market. This is typically something that I would recommend. And the goal with this, and what we know from a lot of the research studies, is that this can help improve our cough, breathing, and swallowing muscles. Okay, so those are three pretty important groups of muscles there. And we know that if we use this early and consistently, that we can actually help strengthen and maintain strength in those muscles as the disease progresses. Let's just, break it down a little bit. But again, with the EMST, we're kind of really targeting abdominal muscles, internal intercostal muscles, which are these tiny, tiny little muscles in between your rib cage, and the accessory expiratory muscles. Okay. So by strengthening these muscles, that can actually help us improve our airway clearance and ventilation, right? So we know with ALS that our respiratory muscles can weaken over time. So this is a way to kind of help maintain that, right? So why do we want to strengthen our cough muscles? Again, goes back to airway clearance, right? A strong cough is essential in clearing mucus, saliva, and foreign particles, which would be food and liquid particles from our respiratory tract. That's why this is so important. And basically, when you go to your clinic visits, the respiratory therapist might be measuring your peak cough flow. I'm not sure if everybody does that, but that's what I'm used to. They also might be measuring like MEP and MIP, which is maximum expiratory pressure or maximum inspiratory pressure. And I did focus a little bit on the MEP here, because typically when we use these expiratory muscle strength trainers, we will be measuring a MEP. So if you go to like an outpatient speech therapist, or maybe in the hospital or something like that, they might be using this measurement. So this correlates with cough strength in a way. It's the maximum pressure that we're able to generate while we're exhaling against resistance. So it is a good indicator of how strong our cough is and how effective our body might be at clearing out and expelling mucus, preventing aspiration, and in turn, what that helps us to do is reduce the risk of pneumonia or respiratory infections. They found in a bunch of studies using the EMST that PALs were able to increase their MEP by about 5 to 10 centimeters of water pressure, which is the measurement it's the pressure measurement that they're using to measure this. This could be a really excellent tool. The people who didn't use the EMST were not able to maintain their MEPs or increase them, and they actually found a faster decline, right? So again, I just want to highlight that why this is a really important tool and can be really beneficial. So that was airway clearance. The other thing that the EMST has been found to help with is the ventilatory cycle, right? So even though we're targeting expiratory muscles, we can actually still improve our ventilatory cycle and have a more effective gas exchange, right? So when you take a breath out, you're supposed to be able to push all of that air out of your lungs, right? But if we have reduced residual volume, meaning like there's too much air left in the lungs after the exhalation, we become more inefficient, right? So this device actually helps improve that residual volume that's left over. There's less of it, and which again means better gas exchange, and then we also find that this can help enhance our speech breathing, right, which relies on controlled exhalation. So if you're not able to take a good inhale and exhale, it's going to be harder to coordinate your speech. I just want to quickly go over with the EMSTs, and here I'll just show you the first one again. There is the back part there with all the colors, indicates the different centimeters of water pressure. That's a resistance knob on the end. And the front piece is the mouthpiece that you're kind of blowing or exhaling into. So general protocol is it's about, they have you do 5 sets of 5 breaths, 5 times a week, right? So it ends up being 25 exhales total. Takes about 15 minutes because you have to take breaks in between each set pretty much, because you don't want to, if you try to do it quickly, you might feel a little lightheaded, which we don't want. And again, you do the training 5 days a week, so you could do it Monday through Friday. And then each week you want to increase the resistance by a quarter turn, okay? So this is basically working off of a general strength training protocol. And again, we're just targeting these tiny little muscles that we use for expiration. The green device here is the EMST Lite. So it has a lower resistance than the blue one. This one I would recommend for people who are maybe a little more advanced in the disease, or who maybe have some lip weakness and can't get like a great seal on the mouthpiece. This might be the right device for you. The green one goes from 0 to 75 centimeters of water pressure, and the blue one goes from 30 to 150. So there is some overlap in both devices. And I would say if you had the blue one and it's becoming too challenging, you might want to switch to the green one and ease things up a little bit. Depending on what your forced vital capacity is, the therapist might recommend one or the other. And just in general, women have a little bit of a harder time reaching those higher pressures because we have smaller lung volumes. So, the green one might be better for women because of that. All right, let's switch to inspiratory muscle strength training now. So there has been some research supporting the use of the IMST, but not in isolation as far as it relates to like cough, breathing, and swallowing. But I do want to just kind of go through with how the inspiratory muscle strength training can also help, especially if done in conjunction with the expiratory muscle strength training. So we have the, you could see the inspiratory adapter on the side there. The EMST device actually fits into that, and you kind of turn it around and use the mouthpiece that's shown there. There are some devices that have both inspiratory and expiratory at the same time. And again, you can talk to your therapist and your team and kind of find which one might be best for you. But the inspiratory muscle strength training, we're kind of targeting the diaphragm, the external intercostals in the rib cage, and some of the accessory muscles like the sternomastoid and the scalenes. So the inspiratory strength training leads to a stronger diaphragm, right? Which means you're able to take a deeper breath, get more volume in there, helps us maintain adequate oxygenation. It can help increase our vital capacity by allowing us to get a bigger inhaled volume. And if we can maintain or even increase our vital capacity, this might help slow down respiratory decline. And then I think the biggest thing with inspiratory muscle strength training is that it allows us to use less energy per breath, which can help us reduce fatigue and dyspnea, right? So again, these are good benefits if they're used early on and consistently. The studies have shown that it can help maintain our respiratory muscle function, and again, helps keep our cough muscles strong. Cough is how we're naturally clearing and protecting our airway. And then it has also been shown to keep swallowing muscles strong. So specifically these little muscles under here that kind of lift your voice box up when you swallow. So I would definitely speak to your therapist and your team about if this is something you're interested in, if you're a good candidate, and how you can go about, getting it and using it. All right, to switch gears a little, I wanted to just mention the importance of oral care. Oral care is key to minimizing oral pathogens that could increase our risk of pneumonia and respiratory infections, right? So at the end of the day, a lot of the things that we recommend are to help keep us safe and strong and prevent infections, because as we know, we can be more susceptible to these things as time goes on. So oral care reduces our aspiration risk, because when we're, potentially aspirating food and liquid particles, those particles are also mixing with our saliva and ending up in our lungs, right? So we just want to minimize the amount of bacteria that are in our mouth. We also want to make sure that after we're eating and drinking that we're cleaning our mouth out, whether it's a rinse or brushing your teeth or, whatever works for you. Just making sure all of those little particles are out of the mouth. Also, oral care can reduce the amount of bacteria that are just naturally occurring in our mouth, right? If we're not providing frequent oral care, there is a chance for bacterial overgrowth, right? Which we don't want. I did on the pictures here, I just put some suction toothbrushes and suction swabs. These are great tools to be used, especially for people with bulbar ALS, who might have a more difficult time controlling what's happening in their mouth, right? So a lot of times when we brush our teeth, there's like a foam or a liquid that's created that can often slip to the back of the throat, can make us choke, it can make us very uncomfortable. So if we're either using our oral suction or using these little tools that hook onto the suction, you could basically clean your mouth, and at the same time, it's kind of clearing everything up and sucking everything up to kind of minimize that risk that you're going to choke on it. In my experience, I've heard a lot of people, just state that they're scared to brush their teeth because they're choking, on the foam or the liquid. So this is a great solution to help kind of minimize that. I also just want to emphasize the importance of frequent oral care, even if you are tube fed dependent. Just because you're not eating or drinking anything by mouth doesn't mean that there's still not bacterias in there, right? So regular oral care should still be an important part of your routine. I put a little water pick on this slide here. Flossing our teeth can get really challenging. If we have hand weakness, if we're relying on caregivers to help, provide the oral care, this is kind of a great tool to help kind of really get like a deep clean in between the teeth, which helps reduce systemic inflammation that can be caused by gum disease and oral infections, right? So we want to minimize that. Also as part of oral care, we can experience like a lot of dry mouth or mucus buildup as part of the disease. So we just want to make sure we stay hydrated. Again, that we're cleaning our mouth, minimizing the bacterias. And then even using like an over-the-counter product like a Biotene or something like that, that's essentially like a mouth moisturizer, right? All of those things can help keep us safe, minimize bacterias. All right, so that was kind of the swallowing, oral care piece. I want to move on to communication. So about 80 to 95% of PALS can experience difficulty with communication. And, when we have difficulty communicating, this can lead to depression or social isolation, and things that are, really challenging to deal with. Can also lead to frustration, right? For PALS, for caregivers. I just want to go through like a few terms and talk about things that we could do to kind of help manage this. So the first term that you're going to come across is dysarthria, which is the blanket term for like a motor speech disorder. There's different types of dysarthria like spastic and flaccid. Sometimes we can have a combination of both. And it changes our prosody, it can impact our intelligibility, and just the tone of our voice. Hypophonia is a term basically used to describe a weak voice, right? So you can experience hypophonia even if all of your bulbar muscles are functioning well, because a lot of times the root cause of the hypophonia is kind of reduced respiratory drive and impaired coordination. Okay. Basically with the hypophonia, it's very quiet voice. You might fatigue very easily, and your caregivers and communication partners might have a hard time kind of hearing you, right? So how can the SLP help? We can help to kind of maximize your ability to communicate effectively. We could talk about voice preservation. We could talk about compensatory strategies. We could talk about, low to high tech assistive devices and evaluations that will be able to help get you what you need to be more independent and communicate functionally. So let's just talk about voice banking a little bit. This is something that I like to mention on the first time I meet somebody. But basically what it is, it's a way to kind of create a synthetic or now cloned version of your voice that can be saved and stored and used in the future on any type of electronic communication tool or device. And the reason why we do this is because we want to have our own version of our voice. It makes it more personalized. It gives you that sense of like individuality that you've always had, right? And it kind of lets us hold on to that if we're using like an external device to help us communicate. So voice banking, there's a few different softwares that are used, things like Model Talker, Acapella, Voice Keeper. Those are some of the softwares that you might come across. The newest technology, and in my opinion, the best technology is the voice cloning. So voice cloning is using artificial intelligence to kind of generate or mimic a voice. Again, this voice is used the same way as if you had done the synthetic voice banking, but it's more fluid, sounds more natural. It kind of completely eliminates this robotic kind of quality that sometimes we'll get with the voice synthesized, softwares. So that's a really great option we'll talk about how you do that in a sec. And then the message banking, is a way to just record some personalized messages and phrases. It could be things like "I love you" or "Go Mets" or whatever it is that the phrases that are important to you that you say on a regular basis. It's always a good idea to have recordings of those messages, so we can actually put those on a communication tool as well if one was needed in the future. So how do you do the voice banking? I think the easiest way to do it, if you want to do like the voice and message banking the more traditional way, would be to go to the Team Gleason website. Put the website down there, you just go in, you sign up for the voice and the message banking, and they'll kind of help walk you through the process and make sure you're set up with the tools you need. But essentially you're doing this at home on your home computer, sometimes even on the phone, and you kind of do it on your own time. To sign up for the voice cloning, you would go to the 11 Labs website. I have the link down there. They had actually partnered with Bridging Voice. So you kind of are going through Bridging Voice's website to sign up for the 11 Labs. You do need a diagnosis letter, which you can get from your ALS team. because Hollywood is also using this technology and they're charging a lot of money for it. But if you have a motor neuron disease diagnosis, it will be completely covered. As for Team Gleason, they will also help cover any of the cost. Usually once the voice banking is completed, there might be like $100 or $150 charge to download it. They will help cover that cost, right? So, as a lot of things, if the finances are an issue, as this disease can be very expected and have a lot of unexpected costs, there are some ways to kind of get around this. All right, let's talk about compensatory strategies. Okay, so if our speech is changing, we want to talk about compensatory strategies, right? Here's the word again, slow, right? So we want to speak slowly. We want to speak in shorter phrases. We can over exaggerate or over articulate, right, to allow our muscles to kind of get in the shape to say the sounds. You want to make sure you're facing your communication partner, not, back to back or way across the room. If you can reduce background noise, that is super helpful. So whether it's landscapers next door or, an air conditioning on that's making a lot of noise, the television's on, shut it off, right? If we're struggling. You want to take voice breaks as needed. Sometimes speaking can cause a lot of fatigue. Excuse me. So you want to take breaks, right? Whether that's 30 to 60 minutes of just kind of quiet time, reading a book, taking a nap, just kind of not using those little muscles from here to here and giving them a rest. And then we also want to make sure we're breathing, okay? Again, speech is something we do naturally. We don't really think about how it's getting done. And we find a lot of times when we're taking shallow breaths, we're kind of reducing the power in our voice and we're becoming inefficient and we're fatiguing quickly, right? So really, really important that you take a deep breath before you start speaking, right? To maximize power, reduce fatigue. I just want to go over a few communication tools here. We started with the no tech options. These are letter boards, picture boards. We can, if we have good use of our hands, we can point to the pictures with our finger. We could use a stylus. Sometimes we could use a laser pointer that might like hook onto your glasses or a baseball cap. If that's an issue, then our communication partners can help scan for us, right? So essentially you would establish a yes/no system, whether that's eye blinks or a little like head nod or some type of movement. And then the communication partner would basically scan line by line. Is it on the first line? No. Second line? Yes. And you kind of use a yes/no system as you're scanning. This is an iLink board. This is, these options are very old school, but can still be very, very useful. This is a clear letter board. So the communication partner is standing on one side and our pals is on the other side, focused on a letter, right? And if I'm the communication partner, I'm kind of moving the board around until I link eyes and know which letter was selected. I always recommend having something like letter boards, picture boards, even phrase boards that you can make on your own, just having something as backup, because even if we're using a high-tech option, we can't always have that 24/7, but these letter boards and picture boards, they're always easy to grab. You can have them in every room of your home. They could be useful like in the bathroom or in the bed or somewhere where our communication device might not be. Going into low-tech options, we have the boogie board here on the right, which is basically like a writing tablet for someone who might have good use of their hands but not be able to communicate verbally, or maybe they fatigue a lot. I have a voice amplifier on there. This is someone who maybe has a weak voice that, communication partners are having a difficult time hearing, or maybe they can't project as well. This is a really great tool. It's like a personal microphone, and it just makes you louder, so your communication partners can hear you, and it can reduce fatigue as well because you're not pushing as hard and using as much of your body's energy to speak. This is an example of a text-to-speech app. Basically, you're typing something into the bar up top. There's a speak button on there. You could store phrases on them, so things become a little more fluid, and a little faster. Again, there's a bunch of different types out there. Some are free, some are, ranged to like $250. But your therapist or the AAC specialist can kind of help you decide which might be the best tool. You can use your own voice. If you have voice banked, you can use your own voice on a lot of these apps. Not all of them, usually not the free ones, but there are plenty that you can use your own voice on. Here are some high-tech tools. We have the eye tracking devices here. I'd say like Tobii Dynavox is probably the most common one that we see, the PRC Accent. These devices require a comprehensive evaluation from an assistive technology center. So that's speech therapist and the occupational therapist who would normally collaborate to do their parts of the evaluation, do all the paperwork to submit it to insurance. These devices are very expensive, and take a while to obtain. It can be about 3 to 4 months on average once you've had the evaluation. So I think a lot of people have mentioned this already in their talks, but early intervention, and doing something like this earlier on is essential to ensuring that you have these tools, and that you have adequate time to practice with these tools and become familiar with them. Your caregivers can have time to, learn how to use them so that you maintain independence and functionality. So the earlier the better. And just a quick Medicare guideline here. Medicare will pay for one device per every 5 years, similar to the wheelchairs and some other things. This is a head mouse here. A lot of people who have good head and neck control like to use this. This is essentially a head mouse that can manipulate your personal devices, right? So you don't have to obtain a new device. You use your current device, and then the head mouse becomes how you control your cursor. Newer technology that's emerging right now is the brain-computer interface. This is basically interpreting neural signals to control your computer and the cursor. There's been a lot of kind of buzz about this. It's not something that's widely available. It might be in the future, but essentially, the doctors are implanting like a switch into your brain that is able to interpret these signals, right? That are used to then control. Just gonna kind of wrap it up here because I think we're running on time. But essentially, I think, some of the takeaways is, there's lots of different options out there, as far as communication. I always encourage people to have multiple options because, day to day might change. You might prefer something one day and not the next day, and you want these things early so that you have time to become comfortable with it, and your caregivers as well, right? So a lot of these tools require not only you, but your caregivers and family and the people around you to kind of help use them, right? So the earlier the better. Um, I think I'm going to wrap it up here. Here's some references. I thank you all very much, and I think we have some time for questions.
We do. Wow, Jessie, thank you. That was a lot of great information. We do have some questions. There was a lot of interest in the EMST and the IMST. So,
Okay.
so one question is, would EMST benefit, well, it's both for EMST and IMST for somebody who has a tracheotomy.
So, hmm, interesting. I think if someone has a tracheostomy, I think there is a way to kind of still use the device if your trach was either capped or if you had a speaking valve on. So I think, um, I wouldn't typically recommend it because of fatigue, I think would be the biggest issue. We're at the point where we have the trach in place. I think the fatigue factor is going to be like too much of an issue to maybe use it, but I have in just general acute care populations I have used the EMST with trach patients, but it would really I would really want to discuss that with your respiratory therapist, if there's a pulmonologist involved, the neurologist, and yeah, it's not a great answer, I know, but it could be used. I would say not likely.
Yeah, that sounds good. Sounds like it needs a little further assessment.
Yeah.
Okay, next question we have is, if someone is already using a cough assist following respiratory decline, is
Uh-huh.
EMST still useful?
Again, I'm gonna, go back to the fatigue factor. It depends. It kind of depends on a few things. It depends what your like forced vital capacity is. It depends like what your MIP and your MEP are. Those kind of numbers can be helpful in like guiding us. Um, I do have patients who use the EMST and also have a cough assist, but it depends how reliant we are on the cough assist and, how well, what our cough strength is. Are we able to manage our secretions and clear our airway at all? Are we not? I would say maybe the EMST light might be an option if we've already had some respiratory decline. But again, I would discuss it with, the speech therapist, the neurologist, and the respiratory therapist to see if you're a candidate.
Okay, okay. It's a similar question, part of the same question about how late in the ALS cycle is EMST useful? Probably similar answer.
Well, the ideal time to use it is in the early stages, but I think if we're in the kind of mid stages of the disease, it's still appropriate. Um, the um, the only time I tell people to kind of stop using it, because once you kind of hit your maximum pressures and you're doing like a maintenance protocol with it, I do encourage people to continue doing that unless there's any strain, discomfort, fatigue. I would say if you're using it and it's just making you feel really kind of knocked out, it's time to stop, right? And I think, if you had been using it, you've kind of done your part as much as possible to help keep those respiratory and cough and swallowing muscles strong for as long as possible. So it did have benefit, but at some point it can, contribute to decline, like if you're fatiguing or straining with it.
Okay. Another question, if someone has bulbar onset and does not have the ability to have a good seal or open the jaw well, are they able to use EMST or IMST?
Yeah, so there are different types of mouthpieces. So in the pictures that I showed, you kind of had that round mouthpiece, which you need a pretty good labial seal for. But also with those devices, there's more of like a duckbill mouthpiece that tends to be a little easier. A lot of times we'll have to give like a little bit of like cheek support maybe to help us kind of make that seal. We can potentially use a face mask attachment with it. It does diffuse some of the pressure, so you might not be able to go as high, but you can certainly use a mouthpiece. And I would ask your respiratory therapist to maybe give you one in your clinic visit or whatnot. That could definitely be used and attached to the EMST as well.
Okay, great. We have two more questions. Um, do you need a prescription for an EMST or IMST, or can it be purchased over the counter?
Yeah, so good question, and I did not mention that. You can purchase it over the counter. Usually, sometimes Amazon will have these devices. Again, I would just, you want to make sure you consult with the speech therapist and the physician. Make sure there's no contraindications. Some contraindications would be like if you've recently had a pulmonary embolism, if you have uncontrolled hypertension, if you can't create like intrathoracic pressure for whatever reason, those would be contraindications. So you just want to make sure you're checking with your providers before you go ahead and purchase and start using it. But you can get it online. The devices I typically recommend, the EMST 150 and 75, can be just purchased on the website, which is just emst150.com. So you could find those there.
Okay, great. And last question, when would you suggest the best or right time to start voice banking?
So I would say the best time to do it is as soon as possible. I always speak to everybody about it the first time I meet them. It's something, you want to do early on, when your voice and your speech are as typical as possible, right? Because the disease itself can be very unpredictable. None of us can tell you, 6 months from now or a year from now if your voice is going to sound the same or if it's going to sound different. So I would say the earlier, the better. With the voice cloning, they use any sound files that you have. So if you have old videos, recordings from maybe that you used for work, wedding speeches, messages you left to your children or your wife, whatever it is, like all of those things can be used. And even if you spend some time maybe making some recordings, telling a story, or maybe recording some messages and stuff, you could always do that in the future. But as long as you have the sound files and do that early on, I'd say you'd be pretty set. But earlier the better. It's a recurring theme we keep hearing, right?
Right, yes, it's great advice. I do just want to mention that ALS United of Greater New York does have some augmentative communication um, devices that Jessie mentioned. So if you just go to als-ny.org to our website, or you could contact Ben Lehman, our care services coordinator, to find out more about those. So Jessie, I want to thank you so much, and thank you all for attending. I would like to invite you all to attend our next session, ALS Clinical Trials and the NEALS Consortium, presented by Dr. Jinsey Andrews, and it starts at 12 p.m. Thank you all.
All right. Thank you so much.